been an extremely interesting day with a lot of food for thought from very different perspectives. I've been asked to speak about the Islamic State movement and look at a research and policy agenda. And I think one thing that's come out from many of the presentations today, particularly on this last panel, is that we need to understand the Islamic State movement first and foremost as a modern and contemporary phenomenon, much more than we need to understand it as somehow a contemporary manifestation of an ancient or of an essential, let's say, 7th century Islamic phenomenon. So when one looks at in terms of issues that require further research, I mean, one is indeed to try to understand the Islamic State movement's relationship to and with Islam. And if we look at how it's typically described in the media and in public commentary and so on, it seems to be go between, let's say, two poles. On the one hand, we're told, of course, first and foremost by the Islamic State movement itself, but also by, for example, far-right activists in Europe and increasingly mainstream ones as well, that the Islamic State movement is, in fact, wholly consistent with Islam. It's the logical culmination of Islam, if not being the very essence of Islam. And on the other hand, we have the response primarily of many Muslim clerics, to use their phrase, that Islam is innocent of the Islamic State movement and of its actions. I think neither of these positions is particularly helpful, or for that matter, particularly interesting. And then, nor does it help to say, well, there's kind of a straight line that goes from Ibn Taymiyyah to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab to Sayyid Qutb to Osama bin Laden, and then via Saudi Arabia at some point or another to Abu Bakr Baghdadi. I think what we need to investigate more is, where does the Islamic State movement situate itself in terms of Islamic theology and the Islamic tradition, and where should they be situated? And here I think the relationship of the Islamic State movement to Salafism, to Wahhabism, etc., I think are very legitimate questions. I mean, I think it was Toby Craig Jones who said that one of the distinguishing characteristics of Wahhabism is actually allegiance to the Al Saud as political leaders. Now, given that this is not by no means the position of the Islamic State movement, how does one understand the relationship of their theology to Wahhabism, given that they share many of the same sources? I think these are entirely legitimate questions that need to be asked, and we need to go beyond saying it represents the very essence of Islam, or it's absolutely alien to Islam. And here again, the relationship of the Islamic State movement's theology to, let's say, Islamic orthodoxy or Muslim tradition as is practiced overwhelmingly in the Muslim world, I think also requires further examination. A second question is, how do we place the Islamic State movement historically? If we want to understand the Islamic State movement better, do we go back to the early 7th century, or is it perhaps more useful and instructive to look at the early 21st century, which is another way of saying, will we learn more about the Islamic State movement by studying state construction during the early Islamic period, or rather state destruction in our contemporary world? And here I'm referring first and foremost, of course, to the asteroid that caused the Big Bang in Iraq in 2003, but also in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, and for that matter, going back a few decades, as we were discussing in the break, to Palestine in the second half of the 20th century. And added to this, or perhaps related to this, where do we place it? Where do we place the Islamic State movement analytically? And here I think it's useful to also bring, let's say, mainstream political Islam into the discussion, and particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, there's been a whole debate about whether the Muslim Brotherhood functions as a firewall or a conveyor belt to more radical and jihadi forms of Islamism. I think this is an interesting debate, but there's another question that I think is not being asked enough that also needs to be put on the agenda, which is to what extent are nominally secular authoritarian regimes, to what extent do they function as either a firewall or a conveyor belt? I think the obvious example here is Egypt under Anwar al-Sadat, but more recently, of course, we have the Ba'athist regimes in Iraq and Syria. Here one can think, for example, of the Faith campaign in Iraq in the 1990s, and I think Ali, you just gave a very good example of Baghdadi being a state-sanctioned preacher. And of course, in Syria after 2003, the networks that were established to kind of convey militant jihadis from Lebanon and elsewhere via Syria to Iraq and so on. And then, to related to this, but perhaps in a different way, the Gulf states, it's become very fashionable to say, well, if you have a problem with the Islamic State movement, that means Saudi Arabia, etc. What precisely are the connections between, let's call it, the GCC states and the emergence and the development of not only the Islamic State movement, but also other movements in the jihadi world? Is it a question of state sponsorship? Is it a question of ideological affinity? Or is it perhaps a more mundane question of geopolitics and proxy conflict? I think these are issues about which we see too many slogans, but not enough serious research. And then perhaps also related to this, it's become very fashionable to refer to the Islamic State movement as a Sunni movement, which of course it is. But if we look at it in broader historical perspective, particularly when I think I'm referring to a point you made here about finding a Sunni army or Arab Sunni ally to defeat the Islamic State movement. Well, when did Islamist politics begin to become dominant in Arab opposition circles? And for this, I think we need to go back to, obviously, the June 1967 war, which was an important turning point, the 1973 oil crisis, and the enormous new resources at the disposal of conservative monarchies in the Gulf. And I would say it's one thing to preach total rejection of the other in central Najd, when in a sense it doesn't really matter what you think of Shiites or Christians or Jews, because there's not really any of them around to bear the consequences of those views. But when you start exporting those views to Iraq, to Levant, to Egypt, to Western Europe, well, then they become views of consequence. And the other date, I think, that's should also not be neglected as a turning point in this process is, of course, 1979 and the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which I would argue was perhaps the final point at which secular leftist oppositional politics was eclipsed by Islamic opposition politics. And then, if you will, the coup de grace was the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. and the expulsion of the PLO from Beirut. Similarly, I think we need to learn much more about the rivalry between Al-Qaeda on the one hand and the Islamic State movement and the other. I mean, there's a narrative of Baghdadi sending an emissary to Syria and then seeking to co-opt him into the Islamic State of Iraq by renaming it the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and Zawahiri getting involved from Pakistan and so on. But I think there are also deeper political issues that were transpiring about which we're insufficiently aware that transcend geographical and personal rivalries, and these are things about which we could perhaps try to learn much more than we already know. Another issue, which I think is absolutely central to getting a better understanding of the Islamic State movement, is trying to get a better understanding of its governance and administration. My view, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is that what distinguishes the Islamic State movement from many of these other jihadi groups is its absolute prioritization on statehood, on establishing a state, establishing a functioning state, and operating as a state, very different, for example, from the Nusra Front or many of the other Al-Qaeda affiliates. And another thing that distinguishes the Islamic State movement is that it seeks to replace existing states by establishing a state of its own, rather than to seize power of existing states. To the best of my understanding, it was quite happy to retain Mosul and Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, and never really made an attempt to march on either Baghdad or Damascus when it was at the height of its power in the summer of 2014. How does the Islamic State movement govern? What are the modes of its administration? What kinds of regional, tribal, ethnic, perhaps even class alliances or coalitions has it sought to establish in order to consolidate and expand its role? And I think you were making the point about its economic policy. Again, the headlines seem to be dominated by the role of the Islamic State movement in the oil industry. Well, I don't think you need to be an economist to figure out that its main source of income is actually the people living under its jurisdiction. So how has it sought to organize the economy within the territories it rules? And last but not least, service provision. How has it sought to organize service provision? To what extent has it been successful? Sure. Let me see, did I leave anything out? No. So moving right ahead, on the policy side, of course, this tends to be dominated by one of three questions. Either how do we contain and counter, how do we contain and eliminate this movement? How do we counter radicalization? And how do we prevent even more refugees from breaking through our borders? And these are, I don't think it's entirely unfair to say that these are rather unsatisfactory questions to dominate the policy general, and that they've generally produced very unsatisfactory answers. What we need to be asking precisely the kinds of questions that our friend the civil engineer just asked, which is, who are their constituents? On what basis have they been able to establish a constituency, which goes to the other question of, are they a symptom or are they the disease? When we look at youth in Europe, why are some youths in Europe being drawn to the Islamic State movement? And I think the test of the answers we get is, well, then why haven't more youths in Europe suffering the same symptoms of alienation and so on felt drawn to the so-called caliphate? And here there's of course an article by Mahdi Hassan in the New Statesman I believe it was last year, where he was trying to look at how these people got their theological education, and he expected to find that they had been reading weighty tomes of early Islamic theology, but in fact, what they'd been ordering from Amazon and so on was Islam for Dummies, Islam 101, and so on. Similarly, looking at youth in the region, one needs to ask the same question, and I think it was Olivier Roy who posed the question of, are we dealing here with the radicalization of Islam or the Islamization of radicalism? Do we still have 2 minutes? Okay. So, and we also need to look at this globally. I mean, so much of the analysis and policy prescriptions regarding the Islamic State movement seem to be focused almost entirely on either the Mashriq or Western Europe. But I think one thing that characterizes the Islamic State movement is that it at least has aspirations to be a truly global movement, and has managed to establish a presence not only in the Horn of Africa, but also further afield in Central Asia, even in parts of China, Southeast Asia, and so on. So in terms of the question of radicalization and so on, I mean, I think we really need to have a better historical awareness, one that at the very least extends back to 2003, but I would argue also extends a bit further back. Osama bin Laden, whether one chooses to believe him or not is a different matter, but in one interview said that the seeds of 9/11 were sown in Sabra and Shatila. Now, if one takes that kind of historical view, that traumatic, exceptionally disruptive, if I can call it that, actions have political consequences, the invasion of Iraq, of course, being the other obvious example. We need to develop, I think, a much more acute historical awareness in terms of trying to develop any policy agenda regarding this movement. And my final point would be just to reiterate what my predecessor said, that how do we develop national politics and the politics of citizenship to go beyond what has become an increasingly sectarian understanding of citizenship and politics in the Middle East. Thank you.